Joining me now from Alexandria, Virginia, presidential historian and preeminent Reagan biographer, Craig Shirley. Craig, I think the services today pretty much exemplified what George H.W. Bush wanted. He wanted him essentially simple, and I think that's what we got. He was a very humble person, a war hero, flew 58 missions, was shot down, barely survived, and of course went on to become a prominent player on the political landscape in this country. But these events of war and in life and family, I think, shaped him to be what I would call, Craig, a very pragmatic person.
Yes, I agree. I think that George Bush was one of those unique people who was at his best when things were worse. Overlooked the last couple of days, Graham, is that when he was shot down over Chichijima in 1944, and then he was subsequently picked up and rescued by a submarine, he went back into the fleet and flew more missions. In subsequent wars, like in Vietnam, is that you did your tour of duty, or if you were wounded or if you were shot down, you went home. But he didn't. He went right back in and flew more missions. And I think that exemplifies George Bush. I remember, the assassination attempt on Reagan, where he was calm and cool and collected, unlike Alexander Haig, who had a disastrous press conference at the White House. Other times when Reagan relied on him, and then his own presidency. His hand on the tiller of state was a very steady one.
And would you define him, as I would, as almost a prototypical GOP public servant? I'm not talking conservative. I'm talking Republican public servant. He was a faithful vice president to Ronald Reagan, without a doubt, even though they differed. And let's face it, there was vehement opposition to Ronald Reagan during the 1980 presidential campaign when Bush ran against Reagan. He was not a conservative, but of course he came eventually into the Reagan fold, and he would be defined, in my opinion, almost as a policy wonk, a Republican policy wonk.
Yeah, I agree, Graham. He was more of Reagan was more of a populist conservative. George Bush was more of a traditional conservative. He was moderately conservative. He and Reagan disagreed sharply in the 1980 primaries on abortion, tax cuts, the Panama Canal, how to deal with the Soviet Union. But winning national elections is about compromise and reaching across the aisle, and that's what Reagan did in making that historic phone call to George Bush to ask him to join the ticket with him, because he produced what was then a unified convention, bringing together the conservative elements with the more moderate traditional elements. And that went on to a historic victory over Jimmy Carter in November of 1980.
A couple things stand out to me about the tenure as president of George H.W. Bush. One of them was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Obviously, it was the result of Reagan policies, but George H.W. Bush did not want to spike the football. And I understand that, but he also, in my mind, almost missed a teachable moment for the world that, hey, American values, constitutional values of liberty and freedom can win out.
I couldn't agree more with you, Graham. In October, November of 1980, I wrote a long memo to the White House and various key aides, making the case after Gorbachev had announced that the Soviet Union would end as of January 1st, 1991, and why Bush needed to go on national television, why he needed to pay tribute to every president from Truman all the way up to Reagan and their anti-communist policies, why 55,000 boys did not die in vain in Vietnam and 33,000 did not die in vain in the Korean War, and how the long twilight struggle of good versus evil, of freedom versus collectivism, was won by the good guys. The bad guys lost and the good guys won. And I think he missed that point. That was his choice. That was his decision. But it was a speech that FDR or John Kennedy or Reagan probably would have given to make the victory over communism meaningful to the American people and to the world.
Another defining moment, the Persian Gulf War. I believe it's debatable whether the war was absolutely necessary. We'll leave that to the sidelines right now. But it was executed like a geopolitical surgeon, and on the foreign policy stage, that's where George H.W. Bush would shine.
Yes, absolutely. He put together one of the most impressive coalitions in the 20th century, bringing in many, many countries, getting the United Nations backing, and with a limited mission, which was to oust Saddam from Kuwait. I think that you're right, is that there are people who question the wisdom of it, but it was done with a minimum loss of life and total complete victory. So the end results were successful for George Bush. and for the West.
Want to see more videos like this? Click on the link below and subscribe to One America News on YouTube, and call your cable provider and kindly demand that One America News is added to your lineup. Call and subscribe today.